Welcome to my YouTube channel. On this channel, we find facts and fine-tune figures. Welcome back. I hope you are enjoying this uh, fabric series. So we are going to do our first project in this course series, which is going to be ingesting data from an API data source. In this project, I saw it online where it was ingested from an API data source using traditional data engineering toolkit, where you are connecting to an API data source, you are transforming it with Python, and you are also storing that data in your Amazon S3 bucket, which is now being automated using Apache Airflow. So you can see how cumbersome this can be as against what we are going to be using in this project. We are just going to connect to the API source and use only data factory to ingest that data into the lakehouse. Come with me. So for this project, you need to come to this website, openweathermap.org. So where you are going to get your API link. But before you can proceed, you need to create your own account. This is my own account now. Because if you don't have an account on this website, you won't be able to get your API key that we are going to be using for this ingestion. So what you will do is that you create your own account. So once you create your account, then you can just navigate on the website and look for the API that you want to call. Not all of them are entirely free. Some are include in paid uh, options. So I'll click on API. So once I click on API, there are a number of APIs here. All of them, you have the one for bulk download, for weather alerts and all of that. So but the one that I'll pick for this demonstration is this one for 5 day and 3 hour forecast. You can see that it is included in both free and paid subscription. Others are enterprise subscription plans, so you won't be able to call this API. So this is the API you want to call. So to call this API now, I need to come to API doc. So from API doc, I can then see the link to call the API. So this is the link to call the API. This is the link to call the API, and then you will need your API key, which is why you need to sign up on this website and create your own so that you can come here and click on API keys. So once you click on API keys, you have your API keys that you can generate that you can now use for your data ingestion. So you can come back to your Fabric environment. So to do this project now, we are going to come back to our workspace, which is Fabric course workspace. So from our workspace now, we are going to create a new pipeline. So I'll switch to my data factory experience. So for my data factory experience, I'll click data pipeline. So for this data pipeline now, I will call it project one, project one, which is ingest data API source, then I'll click on create. So once I click on create, I'm going to have access to the data factory and data pipeline interface, from where I'm going to use a copy activity to ingest data into my pipeline. So to ingest data from API source, I will click on copy. So then I will use copy data. So once I have to configure my source, my destination. So to do that, I will come to source. So the source that we are ingesting data from is an external source. So I will click on new connection. So once I specify a new connection, then I'll come to generate protocol here and pick REST. So immediately I pick REST, I will just click on continue. So after I click on continue, then I will go to my course material, where you have your base URL and also your relative URL, or you can come on the website itself. You know that we are calling this 5 day forecast. So this is the API call. So you have the URL right here, but it gets interesting because you need to be able to identify the base URL and also the relative URL. So I'll come back to my Fabric environment. So what you can do is that you can copy this URL from your Fabric environment. Ensure that you use this HTTPS, because if you don't use it, you're probably going to run into error. Remember that what we are calling is a generic protocol. So this HTTPS is very important. So I'll copy the base URL right from here. So once I copy the base URL, then I'll go back to my Fabric environment. Then I'll paste the base URL. Then I can now click on OK. You can leave every other thing. Then I click on OK. So once I click on OK, then I have the next screen. So on this screen now, I need to also specify the relative URL. But before I do that, I need to test my connection and see if the base URL I copied is working fine. So I'll click on test connection. I will click on test connection. Now that I've clicked on test connection, I will expect that it's going to connecting successfully. So now it's connected successfully. So I will come back to my resource material, then copy this relative URL. So once you have it copied, paste it in a notepad. So on that notepad, this is it. So on that notepad now, you have to edit it. So I will paste it right here. Okay, I didn't copy. So let me go back to my GitHub environment. So I'll copy this relative URL. I'll copy this relative URL. So once I have it copied, then I'll go to my notepad. Then I'll paste it right here. So this is the relative URL, but this URL is not useful until you provide the argument, because if you go back to the documentation for the API call, you realize that this is required as part of the API call, which is your latitude information. You have to provide it in orange, the same thing for your longitude and also your API key. So that is why I'm pasting the relative URL in a notebook. So now what you can do is to go on your browser and search for the latitude and longitude information of your desired location. In my case, I'll be using the longitude and latitude of Lagos. So this is the latitude of Lagos. So I'll pick this. I will do Control C. Then I will replace it in my relative URL. Then I'll paste it right here. Then I'll paste it right here. So once I do that for both the latitude and longitude, I will replace the latitude part, I will replace the longitude part, and then my API key, you can get your API key from the website itself. So on the website, you just come to API keys and then you get this key right here, you copy and then you also replace that part of the URL. Now this relative URL is now ready for use. So I can now copy it and take it into my Fabric environment. So I will paste this relative URL here. So then I'll click on preview data. So while I'm trying to preview the data, I will go back to the API website and then I will go back to where I have the API call. You can see the parameters of your API call, your latitude which is required, your longitude is required, then your API ID too is also required. And then if you scroll down, you see example of API call. So if you use this API for example now, it's going to give you the latitude, the API and the weather data of this particular latitude and longitude, but you always require your API key, which is why you need to come here, create your own account and then generate your own API key. Then the API response is going to look something like this, like a JSON file. So if I go back to my Fabric environment now, I'm expecting a file that is a JSON file like this. JSON files are unstructured data. So this is what I have for the API call. So I'll just scroll, then I can click on close. So I'll close this interface now. Then I need to configure my destination also. So I'll click on destination. So now I know that I'm ingesting into a lake house. So I'll just keep it on lake house. I'll keep it on lake house. I could as well ingest into KQL or warehouse. So we are ingesting into a lake house, and then I can now scroll here and pick that lake house, or I can even create a new lake house from scratch. So now that I've selected the lake house I want, this data that we are ingesting now can be either ingested as a table or as a file. If I choose the option of file, it's going to load JSON file for me, but I want this data to be ingested as a table. So I'll click on table. So now that I'll click on table, I need to give my table a name, or I already have a table before, I can just use that. So these are the tables that we have in this lakehouse, which does not fit into the data structure that we are going to pick. So I'll just click on new table. So once I click on new table, I'll just call it weather data. So then I'll click on create. So once I click on create, then I have to come to my mapping right here and see if my table is being mapped correctly. So it's not auto picking it. So I can just click on import schema. So once I click on import schema, then it's going to pick the schema from the data source, and then from here I can pick the schema of what I want and what I do not want. So what I can do now is that, okay, these are the schema that I have in the data, so I can pick the ones that are relevant. Now you can always go back to the documentation and see what each of these column means. So these are the source schema, and then this is the type, then this is destination, and then this is also the destination type. So on the API call itself, I can then see what each of these column header means. So this is telling me that this is the maximum temperature, this is the atmospheric pressure at sea level measured in this unit, and on like that. So let me come back to our fabric environment. So now fabric environment, I will pick few columns. I will pick the mean temperature, what the temperature feels like, and then I can pick the pressure also. Then I can pick as many columns as I want. Let's just pick about 5 or 6. So I pick all of these. So once I pick them, then I'm sure that this has been properly configured. So I can come to my validate tab, and then I can see that your pipeline has been validated successfully. Then I can click on run. So once I click on run, I'll be prompted to save it. So it's going to take time depending on your internet speed and the volume of the data that you are calling from this API source. So let's wait for it to run. And then once it's done running, we'll go and check our lakehouse and see if you have the data available in the lakehouse. So this data has been ingested successfully. So let's go to our lakehouse and inspect what we have in our lakehouse. So I will just refresh this table now and see if that data has been ingested successfully. So I will click on refresh once more. I'll click on refresh once more. So once I click on refresh, you see we now have weather data here. So I can inspect that data and see what I have in my lakehouse. So this data has been ingested successfully. But there is something else that we need to do, which is to transform this data and possibly automate this process. So we now have our data in the lake house that you can now interact with and do whatever you want to do. So data has been ingested into this lake house. So we are not going to end there. So we are just going to go back into our pipeline. So once we come back to our pipeline, we need to now clean this data and make it cleaner further. So this can be like our raw data ingested from the API code. So to do that, we are going to add another activity into our pipeline. We are going to add a data flow activity. So this data flow activity now, we need to now link it. So there are 4 icons on this copy activity, and every activity have these 4 icons right in front of them. The first one being on skip, this one means if this pipeline is successful, then this one be if the pipeline fails, and then this one be on completion. So we'll stay on our copy activity. So we want it to be such that once the copying activity is done, our transformation too should happen using our data flow activity. So what we'll pick is on success. So on success, so we now need to configure our data flow activity. So I will select my data flow activity, then I will rename this data to cleaning data. So once I give it a name, I will click it again, and I will come back to my setting. Let me just close this interface. So once I get to my settings icon, then this data flow has been provided a name. Provided a name. So I'll come to setting, and this is the name of this data flow. So I'll come to setting now. So from the setting, I will create a new data flow. So if I create a new data flow from here, it's going to open up Power Query for me, which is data flow gen 2. So you can see the name of data flow already. So once that is done, then I will now pick the data from the source. So the source now is now the lakehouse that we had ingested that data into. So I will come to get data. So once I get to get data, I'll click on more. So from more, I know that my data is now available in the lakehouse. So I can just click on view more right from here. So I can click on Microsoft Fabric, and then is in a lakehouse. So I'll pick a lakehouse. Then I will click on next. So after next, I'll wait for it to load and connect to that data source. I know that my workspace is Fabric course, so I'll expand my workspace, and then of course I'll expand my lake house also. So after I pick on my lake house, there are a number of tables, views that are already existing in my lake house. So I'll pick this weather data, then I'll click on create. So this is trying to just preview the data. We already know what is in the data, so I will just click on create. So once I click on create, then I can do the data cleaning and transformation that I want to do on this data. So let's wait for it to load up. Now this data set is available in my Power Query, so I can do whatever transformation that I want to do. So for the sake of time, I will just rename a few column and then enforce some certain data type for the date column. For example, now this date column is in text, so I will just change it to a date data type or a date time data type. So I can force it to a date time data type. Then I can call it maybe loading date. So I will rename it to ingestion date, or let's just call it load underscore date. Okay, so I will call it load underscore date and then I'll hit enter. So that is done for me. So now I can now say publish, but before I publish, let me quickly rename this. So this will be transforming API data. So now earlier you see that our destination is not picked automatically, so I need to add this data to destination now. So I will click on add to destination. Either I want to add it to my Azure SQL or my lakehouse or my KQL database or my warehouse. In this case, we still want to put it on that lakehouse, so I'll pick a lakehouse. Then I have this new screen, then I'll click on next. So from this next, I can then navigate to the destination I want my data to be. So our workspace is still Fabric course, and then I'll pick the lakehouse that I want to put my data into, and of course I can specify the name here. So I can call it transformed. I can call it transformed weather data. Transformed weather data. Then I click on next. So once I click on next, then I'm sure that uh the the destination has been specified appropriately. And if I also want to rename it or change it, the destination name here, I can do that. So I'll just click on save setting, either append operation or replace operation. So it depends on what you want to do. So I can click on save. I can click on save. So once I click on save, then I have the next screen. My destination has been specified. Then I can click publish data. So this data will be published into our lakehouse. Now we have the raw data as was ingested from the API call, and also we have it as a transform data. So once the data flow is done loading, then we can come back into our lakehouse and see what is available in our lakehouse. So our data flow is still loading. Once it's done loading, then we'll go to our lakehouse to check what we are ingested. So our data flow has now ingested what we have in our environment. Now you can come to our lakehouse to inspect what we have. So we have weather data. So I will just refresh this table again and see what is available. So I will click on refresh. I will click on refresh. So we now have transform weather data. We have transform weather data, but we are also still not done. We need to automate this process such that once we have new data every time, this data lake house is actually up to date. So I will come back. So because I reload, I had to start all over again. So I will come to my activity tab, then I will pick a data flow activity. Then that data flow activity, I want it to be configured. Then I'll come to my settings. So from my setting, I'll do a drop down. Then I'll pick transform API data. So you see why it is important to give your Fabric object a meaningful name. So this is the data flow that we created earlier. So I'll pick this data flow now, and then I will link this copy activity to this data flow activity. So I will link this copy activity data flow activity so that on success, then it should come to this data flow activity and do that data cleaning for me. But I also don't like the name of this copy activity, so I will just rename it copy data from API. Then data flow activity 2, I will rename it to I will rename my data flow activity, come to my general, and on data flow for API data cleaning. So I have given my activity meaningful names. Now we can now make sure that we get notification if this pipeline is running successfully or if it's failing. So to do that, I can add my Outlook activity into my pipeline. So I'll bring that here, then I'll just adjust this one, then I'll link it to on fail. So I want to be notified if this pipeline refuses to fail. So I'll select my Outlook activity, then I will leave it as default name, then I'll come to settings. So on this setting icon here, I'll be prompted to sign in my Outlook account. So I'll sign in here. So once I sign in, I'm going to also be prompted to give it access. So I'll wait for that to come up. Now it's coming up. Then I'll pick the email address. So once I pick the email address, um I will have to grant it access also. So I grant it the access that is required of it. Now once the access is granted, then I know that I have to do the validation, provide the email and everything that needs to be done for this account. So I already opened my Outlook account here. So I'll copy my mail address, then I'll come back to my Fabric environment. I'll paste that. I can also give it that pipeline notification. So then I can just adjust this space and type here, dear Francis, comma, your pipeline failed, failed. Please take action. So I've configured this Outlook activity tool also. So I can now come to my run tab, then I will validate my pipeline and see if everything has been done correctly. So I have a copy activity, I have a data flow activity, and I also have an Outlook activity in case my pipeline fails. So I can then click on run. So once I click on run, I expect that my pipeline will run successfully, and then every time I know that the data in my lake house is up to date. Now we are not done, so I will just close this interface while the pipeline is running on the background. We have to schedule this pipeline. So to wrap up on this project now, we need to schedule this pipeline to be running at regular interval. So I'll turn this on. So once I have it on, then I'll select the frequency I want it to be happening. I want it to be happening hourly, and I want it to be happening every 5 hours. So starting from today and starting from right now, and then I don't want this thing to stop in any time, so maybe I can just pick maybe 2028 December 31st, and then once I do that, time and minutes. So once I do that, then I can click on apply. So once I click on apply, then I need to pick my time zone also. So I'll pick UTC plus one. I'm in West Africa, so I'll pick UTC plus one. Then I'll click on apply. So this pipeline has been automated, and that brings us to the end of our very first project. So we have been able to ingest data from an API data source using just the data factory, as against having to use your Python, having to use your AWS S3 bucket, and also using your Apache Airflow. Those are three different products, but with Microsoft Fabric, you can do the same ingestion with your data factory. So this pipeline now has been configured to be running. So once this pipeline fails, you get a notification on our Outlook email that the pipeline has failed.